Hi everyone. Welcome to week 2 of the Social Psychology of Work. It's great to have you back. This week we'll continue to learn about Goffman's theory, with a focus on teams and regions. Make sure you read chapters 2 and 3 of the Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. I'm going to hand it over to the professor now. Andrew, I can't believe that you shaved off all of your facial hair.
Yeah, thanks, Irving. Yeah, I had to shave it all off. My wife was basically threatening to shave it off in my sleep, and so I took matters into my own hands. I hope that this clean shaven look improves the image that I'm trying to project to my audience. I'm playing the role of a professor right now, and I want you all to believe that I'm an expert. So I wonder if this clean shaven look contributes to this definition of the situation that I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, I'm pleased that you've returned for week 2. Welcome back. This week we'll be talking about Goffman's ideas surrounding teams and regions. So last week we thought about performances from an individual point of view. And yes, individuals often give performances, like I'm giving an individual performance right now, but we also frequently give performances in teams. And so we'll look at some of the dynamics underlying teamwork in a dramaturgical context. We'll also spend some time looking at the distinction between the front stage, which is where we perform, and the backstage, which is where we prepare for our performances. So as you'll see, geography plays a really important role in social interaction. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this week's lecture and that you keep up the good work. Let's get started with the lecture. Okay, so this week we'll be learning about teams and regions. The lecture will be divided into 2 parts. In part 1, we'll have a look at Goffman's conceptualization of teams and teamwork. After that, Irving, my avatar, will ask you to do a writing exercise where you contribute to the online forum. Then we'll return for part 2 of this lecture series, where we'll look specifically at the concept of regions and regional behavior in dramaturgy. So let's not waste any time getting started. You might recall from last week that I described dramaturgy as qualitative game theory. So game theory, you might remember, is a way to mathematically model interactions between groups and individuals who can choose to cooperate with each other or to defect, betray, or compete against each other. So basically, this describes Homo economicus, which is Latin for economic man. This is a fundamental assumption underlying Goffman's dramaturgy, and one that's shared by most, I would say, orthodox economists. That is to say that we are rational actors seeking to serve our own self-interests. Liberal economists from Adam Smith through to Milton Friedman share this view that we are utility maximizers who can be relied upon to make rational decisions in everyday life. To a certain extent, Goffman believes this too. He argues, I would say perhaps more implicitly than explicitly, that when we interact as individuals, we are mostly trying to define the situation to serve our own interests. Not always, but mostly. He also argues that when we interact within a group, again, we are mostly trying to define the situation to serve our group interests. So he views a team as any group of individuals that are performing together. And this can include, obviously, family and friends, but also work colleagues or even strangers. So let's think about how this concept might apply in the workplace. So first, we can pursue individual interests against individual interests. A good example of this might be a job interview where two individuals are competing against each other for one job. Each tries to define the situation so as to create a favorable outcome for himself or herself. Secondly, we can pursue individual interests against collective interests. So again, a job interview is a good example. Here you have something of a negotiation between the individual interests of a job applicant vis-a-vis the collective interests of the organization. And sometimes those interests overlap, in which case the applicant is offered the job, and sometimes they don't, in which case the applicant is unsuccessful. And finally, we can pursue collective interests against collective interests. So a good example here might be two work teams that are competing against each other either within or between organizations to be more productive. The key point here is that most interaction, according to Goffman, is aimed at serving either self or collective interests. Now, in everyday life, it's often not entirely clear who belongs to a team. This is because teams oftentimes collude in advance. This is a real advantage that teams have over their audiences. They have the opportunity to come together before a performance and effectively to rehearse their act. So this collusion often leaves the audience in the dark on matters that are pertinent to understanding what's going on. Collusion allows the team to misdirect the audience and to better control the definition of the situation. In addition, collusion prior to performance builds a sense of trust and solidarity within the team. There's something satisfying about a mutually shared secret. Members of the team bond over the knowledge that they know something that the audience doesn't know. Many secret teams use spies to control a situation or to surveil other teams. For example, an auctioneer may send in secret members of the audience in order to artificially drive up bids. Sometimes secret teams are used to teach the audience a lesson, as illustrated in the following clip.
Are you texting in my class? Maybe, okay. Nice one. What kind is it? Like steroids?
Yeah.
Very nice. Look worth a couple $100 at.
I got it. The discount.
Oh, like when you first sign up. You have to replace it. What would it cost me? Probably several hundred. Yeah. That's a shame. There you go. Any questions on texting in class? Never a good idea. AJ, can you stand up here? AJ can take a bow. AJ was a student in the class last year. Thanks, AJ. This, for those of you that are interested, is actually a mock-up of a droid that they use as a display model at like the Verizon dealer and the Boost and all. Destined, just you're worried about the environmental implications. It's destined for trash heap anyway. That's where functional.
Just like in the wider economy, teams are most successful when there's an effective division of labor. This means that members of the team develop a specialization in the performance, thus rendering it overall more convincing to the audience. Developing a specialist role within a team leads to greater efficiency in its quest to define the situation. Of course, not everyone can play all roles simultaneously, so what we do is we focus on one or just a few roles at a time. Goffman highlights a few of the key roles that are played in teams. The persuasionist is in charge of rhetoric and is often the most effective in bringing the audience onto the side of the team. This team member tends to be more extroverted and socially adept. Some team members might specialize in emotional projection. So rather than persuading others through logic, they persuade others through appealing to their emotions. Then, of course, there is the comic relief, or the funny one in the group. This role is particularly important in tense situations that need to be diffused in some way. Some specialize in damage control, that is to say, picking up the pieces when a performance goes awry. Others specialize in projecting the strength of the group. There are also those who provide background support or logistics to the group. So Goffman notes that teams or groups are hierarchical, with some being more deferential to other members. But again, the degree of deference depends on the social context. So for example, a wife may be deferential to a husband in public, but in private she may completely dominate him. So the key here is that teams naturally develop specializations that lead to the effective functioning of the group. Let's take a look at some of the key definitions provided by Goffman. So he defines a performance team, or just a team, as any set of individuals who cooperate in staging a single routine. He defines familiarity as intimacy among teammates based on the fact that they are all in the know about the performance. He defines teammate as someone whose dramaturgical cooperation one is dependent on in fostering a definition of the situation. Remember that a teammate does not always have to be familiar like a family member or friend. Occasionally, strangers can become team members as well. He defines a clique as a small group joined together for informal amusements. Now, we usually think of cliques as something that develops at school, but they also developed among adults and especially in the workplace. A clique often becomes exclusionary in order to strengthen its sort of in-group identity. A star is the key or central performer in a group. He or she plays the key leadership role. In a workplace context, of course, this is usually the manager or the boss. And finally, a purely ceremonial role is a performer who makes essentially an aesthetic contribution to the team. In other words, he or she serves only as window dressing. Now, my personal favorite example of a purely ceremonial role is, of course, the left shark at Katy Perry's Super Bowl performance. So, teams are fragile. This is especially the case when there's misrepresentation in the performance. It takes only one person on a team to defect and expose the whole performance as a charade. Each team member is interdependent on the others, and for this reason, teams can only function effectively provided that there is a high degree of trust amongst the members. In the absence of that trust, the team's secrets can be revealed by a rogue member bent on taking down the rest of the team. Now, obviously, the larger the team, the more difficult it becomes to sustain a definition of a situation. Large teams tend to have less solidarity, meaning that members are much more likely to turn on one another. Betrayal is a threat to any team. So let's think of some examples, again, in the context of the workplace. Say there's a group of employees who regularly bully a coworker. They will typically protect each other, but occasionally one member turns on the team and then everyone goes down for the bullying. Prosecutors are really good at exposing the fragility of a team. They offer immunity to a member of the team so that they turn on the other members of the team. The individual motive to save oneself can run counter to the team motive to protect each other. Another way in which the fragility of a team is exposed is through public disagreement during a performance. Disagreement among team members threatens the definition of the situation. This is often the result of a lack of preparation in the backstage. Now, all teams make mistakes. It's simply a part of life. Check out the mistake in this sad performance.
Oh no, I think we're lost. Whatever shall we do? Oh look, it's the good fairy. She'll know what to do.
Not to fear, little children. I will help.
Now, that was a mistake. Look, no performance is perfect. Sometimes things just go wrong. It happens to the best of us. Goffman looks at the various ways in which mistakes are made and handled in a team. Occasionally, really only rarely, a performance is halted in order to allow the team members to get their stories straight. This often happens in complex business negotiations, for example. When one team appears to be losing ground in the negotiations because they're not all on the same page, it's quite common for them to call a short timeout so that the team can regroup. Goffman argues that when mistakes are made mid-performance, it's important not to punish the culprit until later, when the team is in private. A public telling off by team members will necessarily weaken the definition of the situation that they're trying to foster. For example, if an employee makes a mistake in dealing with a customer, the manager usually waits until later to point out that mistake. Obviously, the more preparation the team puts into a performance beforehand, the lower the chances of making a mistake. Additionally, the more control that the team has over the setting, the lower the chances of making a mistake. One important aspect of setting control is to allow for some space behind the scenes where the audience cannot see. This allows problems to be sorted out away from the sight of the audience. Finally, Goffman argues that every team has its star or its leader. Teams tend to be hierarchical, and there's often a power imbalance within them. The star of the team is akin to the director of a theatrical performance. He or she plays the leading role, directs the performance of other team members, and on occasion reins in rogue performers who simply aren't playing their parts correctly. The star also decides who plays what parts and is able to assign different roles to the different team members. In a workplace context, the star is often the manager, supervisor, or project leader. He or she sits at the top of the team hierarchy, and other members serve as their subordinates. Stars or leaders can also emerge organically within work teams. For example, you will be working in teams during this course. So which one of you is the star of your group? And what makes you the star? Okay, I'm now going to hand it back over to Irving, my avatar, so that he can assign this week's online exercise for the LMS forum. Take it away, Irving.